Good morning, everyone. This morning what we're going to be doing is I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on sanding. Now, to practice our sanding, before we start sanding our actual toolbox, we're going to sand these 4 pieces. Some of you might have gotten just 3 pieces because this is one long piece, but most of you should have gotten 4. 2 that are 3.5 inches wide, and then 2 that are 2 inches wide. The goal today is to learn the goal of sanding. We already went over how to assemble our sanding block. What are the 2 purposes of sanding, and then when do we start switching our sandpapers between grits? So we know, number 1, that we always start with 100 grit. 100 grit is going to be your roughest sandpaper, and it's going to do the most quickest, most sanding that we need to do. So here we go. The purposes of sanding, 2 purposes. 1 is to make your board smooth. Okay, so we're going to try to make it smooth. Number 2 is to get rid of all the marks on your board so that we can see the grain. Now, what is the grain? The grain is the material that's right here. See these lines right here? These are all grain lines. So the more we get rid of little marks, you guys look right here, trying to get it to where you guys can see it, we can start seeing some sanding marks. So you might have pencil marks that we're trying to get rid of right here. Try to get rid of these. There's our pencil marks, okay? Or you might have what's called saw marks. Now, saw marks are going to be all the little lines, kind of hard to see on this board, but all the little lines that are on your board that, as it sounds like, are from your saw. Okay, so purpose number 1 is make it smooth. So we could start with our 220 and start sanding our board, and it would make it smooth. However, it would not get rid of all our marks and our saw marks. So we're going to start with 100. Now we know we're done with 100 grit when we've gotten rid of all the marks and sanding marks, and the board is same color and smooth. Now you're going to have variations for the grain. Can't get rid of that, but it should be essentially the same color. Then you're going to move to your 150 grit. That 150 grit is then going to make the grain or the sanding marks smaller. So we had 100 grit, which was bigger particles, so we could get less of them on our paper. So it left bigger sanding marks. So the 150 grit is going to get rid of the 100 grit sanding marks. Then once we've sanded the board entirely with the 150, we're going to move to the 220. 220, it is so fine, the sand on this is so fine that it then gets rid of the marks that the 150 or the 120 left. Okay? So you're going to spend the most time with your 100 grit. If you need, you can kind of clean out the sandpaper with another piece of sandpaper. As you can see, that falls there. So that is the purpose, and when you switch your sandpaper. Now, rules for sanding. Number 1, you always sand with the grain. Okay? The grain direction is going, you can see it better on this one. The grain direction is going this direction, so we're always going to sand that. We're not going to go at an angle, and we're definitely not going to go across. What that does is tears the grain. So we're always going this direction. Number 2 is you don't want to sit and sand in one little spot, because what you're going to do, if you stay in that spot, is you're going to start creating a dip in that. So it's really important that as you're sanding, that you sand evenly across, especially when you get to an edge like this. It's really easy to take this end and start sanding at an angle like that, because your sandpaper is at that angle. So you want to make sure that when you're sanding, you keep your sandpaper flat, which is why this sanding block is really going to make a lot of difference for you. Okay, so an example here, we got a 100 grit. I'm going to keep my paper or my block here. I'm going to hold the piece still, making sure not to sand my hand. Then I'm going to go back and forth here, going with the grain. And what I'm looking for is to make sure that I got rid of all my sanding marks off. Now again, remember, this is practice. What you're trying to do is get used to sanding, so that when we get to your toolbox, you've already had some practice sanding. These pieces are not as critical for sanding as your toolbox. Okay. Now you don't need to worry about the ends of our board right now. So you're just looking to do the face, this face, the edge, and the other edge. Okay? So then you're going to do that with this board and these two boards. That is your goal. By today, all the marks. Now, there's a 100 grit. So now I look at my board. No saw marks, no marks. So now I'm going to get my 150. Again, you're going to spend the most time with your 100 grit. With these grits, it's going to be a little less time. We're trying to make it smooth, and we're trying to make it so we can see this grain really, really clear. Okay? Then the last step, so I would switch out my 150 and I would go to my 220 grit. And that would be one board, really smooth. That grain is really clear, and we can start working. So let me know if you have any questions.